Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the CGA BRI talk series. Today, we have with us Umesh Moramudali and Thilina Panduwawala to talk about their research they recently published with the China-Africa Research Institute at the School of International Studies, Johns Hopkins University. The research is the evolution of Chinese lending to Sri Lanka since the mid-2000s, separating myth from reality. Umesh is a lecturer at the Department of Economics, University of Colombo, and Thilina is the head of economic research at Frontier Research. So welcome to Thilina and Umesh. It's lovely having the both of you here with us today. And I'm very grateful that you both joined us for this conversation.
Thanks, Bhagya. Thanks for inviting us.
So to start off our conversation to the both of you, just a month ago or so, you published this report I mentioned about the evolution of Chinese lending to Sri Lanka. Can you briefly share the main findings of this research? I know it's been massive, it's received a lot of interest overall. I've seen on Twitter, on various social media, how it's been shared. Could you tell us a little bit about the findings? Maybe some of our audience don't know about it.
Umesh, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start and Thilina can add on to that. So one of the key findings in our research was that how much debt Sri Lanka actually owes to China, because there were many different classifications, many different numbers being quoted about this particular issue. Some people said out of total foreign debt, 10% is owed to China. Some said 15%. But our finding shows that in 2022 or at the end of 2021, even Sri Lanka's out of Sri Lanka's total outstanding foreign debt, 19.6% is owed to Chinese creditors. This number is higher than the most of the other estimates. And along with this, what we are also essentially saying is that there's no hidden debt. This number is different, and our number is higher, not because of any hidden debt, but largely because of the different ways of classifying the public debt Sri Lanka uses, which has been misunderstood and misinterpreted by many, which led to the interpretation of Sri Lanka only owes 10% to China. So this is, we identified that largely due to two reasons. One is that this classification of those who say it's 10%, they don't include the debt to Sri Lankan state-owned enterprises, because some of the loans taken by the Sri Lankan government were later transferred to the state-owned enterprises, which are not really indicated as central government debt. So what we did was went back and found those numbers and added back to the total debt that we owe to the Chinese creditors. And the other thing is the loans that we obtained from China Development Bank, which are categorized as market borrowings. I mean, there's a justification for that, because these are not project lending. These were actually, there were bids called for these loans, and then China Development Bank was selected based on these bids as the preference, because they were offered better terms than others who had bid for this kind of foreign currency term financing facility. So that is the reason why our number is higher than the often quoted 10 or 15%. There's no hidden debt. Then we also clarify some myths and realities about Hambantota Port transaction, which already I and few other scholars have already mentioned. But what we provide in our research is we provide much more solid evidence as to how the Hambantota Port deal went down, including the documentary evidence, and went to the extent of finding that loan agreements doesn't consist any asset seizure clauses to say, okay, Sri Lanka couldn't pay the loans, therefore China took over the port. So those are the main ones that I want to highlight. Thilina, I think, will have like one or two points to add.
Thanks, Umesh. So I think beyond the key points that Umesh highlighted, another thing that we highlight is that situating the increase in Chinese lending to Sri Lanka within changes to Sri Lanka's public external debt profile itself. That the increase in Chinese debt, it did not happen in isolation. Sri Lanka was anyway, changing its public borrowings from the mid-2000s onwards because it was losing access to concessionary financing from its traditional multilateral and bilateral partners. So it actually needed to find alternative sources to finance both the fiscal deficit and as well as infrastructure development. One aspect of it was raising capital from the international market through international sovereign bonds or Euro bonds. And the other main avenue was Chinese financing, especially in the form of export credit from China Exim Bank for the coal power plant, for the Hambantota port, and for expressways. So situating China within that overall change is important because in reality, the debt distress Sri Lanka is going through is driven largely by those international sovereign bonds that we borrowed since 2007. And that's putting a lot of stress put a lot of stress on the foreign exchange reserves as well as the overall capacity of the government to repay. Increasing Chinese repayments to Chinese lenders also played a part in terms of the increased distress, but the real driver was the sovereign bonds that were coming due over the past few years. So that is something that we also highlight throughout the paper.
This is interesting, most interesting. And I do have two follow-up questions for the two of you. Umesh, you mentioned about hidden debt. Could you tell our audience, some may not be proficient in economic terminology. Could you tell them what hidden debt is and how do you understand this concept?
Well, I mean, this idea came because I think there's a lot of interpretation when it comes to Chinese lending, right? So first we've been dealing with the whole Chinese debt trap narrative, and then subsequently comes this idea of debt is hidden. So none of the countries are reporting how much exactly they owe to China. So that then certain scholars, some Indian scholars, and then some other Western scholars also, they've highlighted this as, okay, this debt is not really reported within the balance sheets of the government per se. So they categorize this. It's not like there's a very clear definition about it. It's something that the people who interpret this in their research, something that they have come up with. We are not going to the extent of talking about the so-called quote-unquote hidden debt, the debt that are not being reported by the government, any governments regarding Chinese lending. We can't speak for other countries. What we are saying is we don't find evidence that Sri Lanka has any debt, any hidden debt regarding any hidden debt pertaining to the Chinese lending, because all of were recorded, but all of were recorded not necessarily in one place and not under one classification due to different reasons, but they are recorded in different places. And Central Bank of Sri Lanka actually had provided all these numbers to say, okay, Sri Lanka do actually owe this much to China. This was very clear during the presentation to the creditors as well. And even the numbers quite tally with the numbers provided by the World Bank in the international debt statistics. Again, I must emphasize that we can't speak for the other countries, but because we have gone in detail about Sri Lanka's situation, but in Sri Lanka's situation, all the debts were reported fairly and accurately. It's just that there are different classifications which some people interpret as hidden debt.
Absolutely, Umesh. Going through your report and the research publication, I understood how detailed you all have gone into the research and how much information you all had gathered. And I saw the statistics about the 52% of debt from Sri Lanka going to China. And these are also, like you said, central bank statistics that had come out. Thilina, you mentioned about the context in which Sri Lanka has got borrowed loans from China. So can you tell our audience a little bit about this context now as a Sri Lankan, where all this comes from? But I think we might miss we might keep something if we don't actually explain a little bit about this situation and why Sri Lanka wanted to get all these loans.
Okay. So something we highlight is that there was definitely a political motivation within Sri Lanka's governing parties to have kind of a, fulfill the infrastructure promises that they make in their election manifestos. And because our coverage in our report was from the 2000s onwards, something we mentioned is that both in the 2002 Regaining Sri Lanka manifesto and the 2005 Mahinda Chintana manifesto, infrastructure development takes, pride in place. That is a promise that the political leaders provide during elections. The Mahinda Rajapaksa government, 2005 onwards, took this quite seriously in terms of fulfilling those. For example, the Hambantota port was very much a iconic project that is mentioned in the Mahinda Chintana as something that would be, not only address a lot of problems and poverty and unemployment in the Hambantota district, but drive economic growth in Sri Lanka itself. And something we highlight there is that he was actually, when he came into power, he didn't come with a huge majority into power. And he had to maintain that, balance in parliament, the majority in parliament, and also want to get re-elected again in 2010 while executing a civil conflict at home. So having the economic downturn of that, then he was going through also the global financial crisis. So there was overall slowdown. So using infrastructure development was a very much a political project, but he did not always have the traditional partners, bilateral and multilateral partners supporting him in that endeavor, right? Because Sri Lanka had started to lose access to concessional financing from them after 1997, because Sri Lanka moved from a low-income country to a lower middle-income country. So the alternative financing for his projects, for general financing, came from ISB, syndicated loans, and by getting foreigners to invest in local rupee treasury bonds and bills. But the project financing came from export credit, and the largest source of export credit for that period became China Exim Bank for projects such as Hambantota, for Matala Airport, the expressway, the coal power plant. And these projects did fulfill real infrastructure deficiencies that were there in the country, especially the coal power plant, because even right now, that's up to about 40%, can generate up to 40% of Sri Lanka's electricity generation on any given day, provided it is functionable and the coal is there. And the expressway, for example, to link the capital to the airport. However, when it comes to Hambantota related projects, there is a political angle because Mahinda Rajapaksa, being a long-running MP from the Hambantota district, had this kind of a personal interest in getting these projects in Hambantota running, the port project as well as the airport project, right? Yes, it's part of a long-term project of building kind of an industrial port, etc. And having a second international airport. What we do question in our paper is also the pace at which it was implemented might have been the problem rather than the actual project itself. So that created, and then the pace at which then the repayments came through did create problems. And we actually found something Umesh found in the parliamentary reports as well, is that in 2004, by 2014, the Rajapaksa government itself had realized that it was finding it difficult to, will find it difficult to repay these loans. So in 2014, they had actually discussed with the Chinese, sending a proposal to the Chinese government and to China Exim Bank to start to restructure some of the Hambantota port loans, so that it will be more viable, and also to have sort of a joint venture with Chinese SOEs to further develop the port. So this kind
Thilina,
of...
I will stop you there about the Hambantota port, because we do have to talk a little bit about the Hambantota port. And I'm glad you brought out the context, and you also specifically mentioned about the political connection between the leadership and the constituency, and the fact that the leadership at the time, Mahinda Rajapaksa, didn't have a majority, and that these projects like Hambantota were of political nature to kind of get their political will and support. So it felt like they might even be able to go for future elections. So the both of you, why did you want to engage in a research like this? What prompted you? What was the burning reason?
I started, and Thilina can jump in subsequently. So I've been researching about the debt, Sri Lanka's debt, for a let's say 5 good years now. So this all started with when back in 2016, when I started doing my undergraduate dissertation. So I was doing economic special degree, and I constantly hearing and reading the word foreign commercial borrowings in the weekend newspapers, and sometimes I used to go for like conferences. I was a journalist at the time, so I'm constantly hearing the term foreign commercial borrowings, and at the time it seems to me like, okay, I didn't understand what exactly it means, but I figured, okay, this is something that is changing with regard to the debt of the country, and people were saying, okay, this is something that needs to be talked more. So I caught on to that, and I really wanted to learn more about it. So then I did my dissertation in 2017 as a part of the undergrad program. That the title of it was the implications of foreign commercial borrowings of Sri Lanka. Then only I found out, okay, what an international sovereign bond is, like how much we exactly owe to China. I mean, even at that point, I myself thought, okay, probably the most loans are maybe from China. I mean, later on, I also realized that that was not particularly the case. So after publish this dissertation, I mean, in the sense like after doing the dissertation, I still had a lot of unresolved questions, and I wanted to dig deep more into it. So I wrote few articles to the Diplomat, which receives quite a lot of attention, and then different people wanted to engage more about it. There were different questions keep coming at it. So like I also didn't have all the answers at that point. So I was also looking for answers and trying to get the disaggregated data, and kept requesting data from the external resource department, who actually, by the way, been a great help in terms of providing all the data whenever we requested. So then I wasn't satisfied up until I found out the exact reasonings for certain things and getting the very disaggregated level of data, and kept pursuing about it and kept writing about it. And then that obviously there was the need to publish something concrete and comprehensive rather than publishing few articles, because that has the time, that has the word limitations and also the level of detail that you can provide. So I had the need to provide a comprehensive journal article or a working paper that gives the entire picture of it. And then I dragged Thilina, who was also being very obsessed with the debt situation, and then we together worked on it, and then sent one working paper, like a abstract, to one of the conferences. I think it was in Barcelona, which we didn't get qualified for. Then we got in touch with Thilina. Then we'll, I think Thilina, you can then story.
So how did Thilina get involved in all of this?
My interest in China comes from an interesting side story. I was a medical student in China, in Nanning, for about 8 months back in 2014. So when I did come back and got into international relations and into economics, my interest in China persisted. And of course, my interest in econ comes from very much trying to understand how the, what can I say, the Rajapaksa government was very much a populist government, but once it went out of power in 2015, all these stories about how its economic policies were wrong and the debt issues came out. So that's, understanding why that happened was very critical for me to, switching from international relations into economics. So when Umesh was working on this, I was very much interested to work with him on this.
Thank you. And Umesh, yes, you have written a lot, and I've been reading and following all your work behind the scenes, even though you probably didn't know that. So both of you, in your research, you mentioned that these Chinese loans, right, to Sri Lanka were divided into 5 categories. Can you elaborate on each of these and what distinguishes each of them?
Bhagya, 5 categories or the 5 phases, you mean?
The 5 phases.
So why we broke it down into 5 phases is because we could see 5 particular, periods through which China's lending to Sri Lanka evolved. So before the 2000s, China was lending to us, and that's largely through directly the government of China, the interest-free loans that have been given to Sri Lanka from the 1960s onwards itself, right? And that was a traditional channel. But given China also moved into having the Exim Bank and CDB, all of that from the 90s onwards. And in the early 2000s is when China Exim Bank first lent to Sri Lanka in 2001 for the Moramudali oil storage complex. And there onwards starts that relationship of having export credit from China. And this expands from 2005 onwards with the Norwich coal power plant and then the subsequent projects on Hambantota, Mattala, and the Katnaika airport. Right. So those are kind of the first 2 phases. And the second phase, so 2005 to 2010, is really the boom period, where you see a massive increase in China coming in, and that's where you see all these very high-profile projects also starting off. And then from about 2010 to 2014, you see that consolidation phase where China Exim Bank keeps lending to the second phases of the project started in the earlier period. And especially going through with this massive lending into, for example, the expressway projects. However, in 2015 and 2016, there's a slowdown because the government changes, right? And the new government is kind of evaluating what next, how to proceed. Especially there was a hold actually of the Port City project, which is that although it's an investment project, it affected kind of the relationship, the bilateral relationship a bit. And we see it again, starting off from 2017 onwards, where the government's back to, okay, look, we need Chinese lending to, kickstart and keep the growth ongoing, so these projects ongoing. So you see the Hambantota lease happening in 2017, and you see increased lending from China Exim Bank towards the Central Expressway project, for example. But however, there's also a new phase of lending, new type of lending that comes in from 2018 onwards, because China Development Bank steps in with term loans as a balance of payment and a budgetary financing tool. And this kind of lending is something we haven't seen a lot in other BRI countries as well. Because project lending seems to be the dominant form of lending, and this kind of balance of payments, budgetary support is quite rare. And this actually repeats during the COVID crisis. Again, CDB becomes a critical lender to Sri Lanka in 2020 and 2021 as well, right? And that is the big 4 phases that we've already faced since 2000s. And the 5th phase is what is currently ongoing in terms of the debt restructuring. It's something we think, will carry a lot of lessons for the future, but it's something that's already still unfolding.
Absolutely. So how did you manage to divide these phases, Thilina? What was the criterion that you engaged with to define these phases?
So one thing was the quantum of financing, right? That's what really, differentiates phase 1 and phase 2. Where phase 1 is essentially, the start of the relationship. And then phase 2 and 3, the difference in reality is kind of the consolidation, because in phase 3, what you really see is that the continuation of some of the major projects that were started in phase 2. Phase 4 is really the change in government that affects the start of phase 4, as well as the change in terms of the type of lending, because CDB comes in. So it's both the quantum of lending, the types of projects, and the type of lending.
Right. So the quantum, the types of lending, and the types of project that they're involved in. Interesting. So guys, why do you think there is a lot of misinterpretation, and I guess also to an extent misinformation, especially around the Hambantota port? I did promise you all that we'll be talking about the Hambantota port. So why do you think there is a lot of misinformation around this port?
Transaction for Sri Lanka's Chinese lending, it's not merely a domestic matter. That has been extensively used to justify different ideologies or different geopolitical agendas by different countries, right? So this port transaction in particular was sort of helpful to justify their arguments. I mean, we see that when Sri Lanka was going through the economic crisis, we see people giving different interpretations. Some started blaming for China, some started blaming for Russia-Ukraine war. Some people said that this is because Sri Lanka doesn't have a currency board, different things. So they try to fit in Sri Lanka's issues into their narrative for their benefit. I mean, so the India had a reason to do so. You see constantly Indian media interpreting this still as a debt trap. I mean, something Professor Deborah in her paper mentioned is that this term debt trap was originated by one of the Indian scholars who then used the Hambantota port deal to justify this. And the other reason I think why this Hambantota port deal became so controversial is also the way in which it was reported. Particularly, New York Times wrote an article saying that, okay, China seized the port because Sri Lanka couldn't make the payments. So what we also have to understand is this is a very easy narrative to go with, or this is a very easy narrative to say. It's a very easy story to tell, right? It's just saying like someone lends for something, you couldn't pay the loan, so you took the assets. It's like you couldn't pay off your mortgage, you take the bank take your mortgage, or bank take your car, something like that. It's very easy to digest, but the real transaction is much more complicated, right? Even for us, being studying this for a few years now, it took like very long time to digest each aspect of the transaction, because it's not one transaction. There were few transactions that has happened parallelly for different reasons. So to put in the context, the loans are separate to the lease, but it's incredibly difficult to explain this. Now, we can talk about this in detail, and then in that process, you will also realize that how complicated the transaction is, and explaining that takes time. So it's not something that people like to invest time or listen. They would rather go and believe like, hey, Sri Lanka couldn't pay China's debt, and therefore China took over the ports. And it mattered for the people who promoted it, right? Because for the at one point, Mike Pence used this to say, okay, China is using their power to grab assets. Indians were kept using this to say, okay, because it fits into their agenda. So it was a very easy narrative. And it's a very easy narrative for many people to digest as well, right? So even for us, even now, when we are simplifying this, still it takes a bit of a time to simplify and explain this. Someone must have also patience or the need to understand it, right? So yeah.
Absolutely. You were saying there's a lot of data which I completely understand. I have sat and read through a lot of data for my own PhD thesis, which included a lot of economic data. And also, like you said, Umesh, I think people should want to understand what all this is about. It's not just a matter of head spinning, sheets and reels of paper, but also the ability to comprehend what is there, whether they really want to understand or whether they are going to twist these narratives for, to play for their agenda. Is it convenient, a narrative, right? So I think this is what we are talking about in terms of Hambantota as a Sri Lankan. We see this happening. I think all three of us understand this, where this Hambantota port is being used as a very convenient example. Now, again, back to Hambantota. A significant component of your research, I think 2/3 of your research is based around the Hambantota port and the story of the Hambantota port. Like I said, as a Sri Lankan, I understand the context, I understand the importance. But can you tell our audience, our listeners, this importance and why you thought of including Hambantota port specifically in your research over, say, any other project like the Norochole project or the Matala project or any of the highways? Why was it Hambantota and not any?
So the reason why we wanted to include Hambantota is like because the whole debt trap narrative spins around that, right? Because none of the other loans has the problem of asset seizure. None of the other loans, for example, Moramudali power plant, that was never leased to China, or the same with the expressways, so on and so forth. The very fact that Hambantota port was leased to a China merchant port, a Chinese entity, that gave the idea that, okay, Sri Lanka could not pay the debt, and instead of that, China took over the port. It was, as I mentioned, very easy narrative to promote. And so we had to explain this in detail, because to explain the wider economic issues that Sri Lanka had, and why this transaction actually took place, that it wasn't something that is specifically related to China. It wasn't a Chinese matter, it was a more of a macroeconomic issue. So that putting that in perspective is very important to debunk the myth. And although the myth was debunked, I've written in 2020, I think Deborah also wrote 2021, and I think few other people have also written about this. But even then, some required in detail analysis with the documentation or the evidence for anyone who's going to do research about this particular issue, because the moment you see all the many people, many in the international forums, they still bring up the Hambantota report was taken over by China. So we wanted to put every aspect of the story in detail with the documentary evidence for anyone to refer to and say, okay, this is what exactly happened. And then so that no one can go back and argue and say, like, hey, how about this? Or how about that? Do you know that there was this, or there was this 15,000 acres being taken, etc., right? So that's why we wanted to put a lot more emphasis on it. I think Thilina can go into a lot more details.
Yeah, I think so. Bhagya raised a good question, because if you look at the amount of disbursements from Chinese lenders to Sri Lanka, it's about, I think it's just above 10 billion if you look from 2000 to 2021. And of that, only about 1.3 billion is to the Hambantota port, right? So just above, about 10% of total lending from China to is the Hambantota port. So why bother so much about it? And that's because of the story, partly because of that. Because when Umesh look at the numbers in terms of with the government's external debt repayments in 2017, only less than 3% of those repayments was going for the Hambantota port loans at that point, at which point the lease agreement was signed with China Merchant Port. But the narrative is, look, Sri Lanka couldn't pay the loans, therefore it was given on lease. But the government continued to pay those loans, the repayments, until 12th April 2022, when the debt suspension was announced, right? And the government has to restructure those loans. Those loans still exist. The lease was a separate matter, because Sri Lanka was facing a balance of payments issue and being part of an IMF program. This lease allowed the government to get these funds, not as a loan, but as FDI. Right. And it improved our foreign currency reserves and allowed us to repay actually the maturing ISBs that were coming up as well. So that overall macro story gets hidden in this populist story that's out there in the media. So getting into the details of that, going into the debt repayment numbers, the loan agreements that we were grateful enough to have access to from the Ministry of Finance, has been very critical, and we wanted to bring out those details very much. That's why we spent a lot of time on it.
And I'm glad the both of you did spend a lot of time and going into details, because that's something I think that misses the public eye. They obviously don't either have the capacity or the knowledge to look at all these data and decipher what all of it means to them, right? So I think as a Sri Lankan, I'm really grateful that you all have taken the time and effort to go through these details and demystify what's hidden behind the scenes. Thilina, you mentioned about IMF and also restructuring debt, especially after we went into, especially after April 12th. So, and I think one of the quintessential requirements from the IMF is that China is involved and that Sri Lanka engages in negotiations bilaterally with China to restructure these debt. In your opinion, do you think it's possible? Because there's a lot of conversation around China restructuring and whether China will be forthcoming in restructuring debt.
So historically, China has a long history of restructuring debt, especially the interest-free loans that the government of China provides to governments bilaterally. That is not in question, and those especially in African countries, we've seen China writing off those long-term loans. The problem becomes the export credit, especially from Exim Bank, as well as the loans given by CDB. These are relatively new institutions, even in China's, foreign financing arena, because Exim Bank came in the 90s and CDB was in its current form from the 2000s. So these two institutions themselves don't have a long history and experience of doing these kind of sovereign debt restructuring, being involved in such an episode, because the last episode of this many developing countries going into debt restructuring and default and debt restructuring is in the 1980s, before these institutions were constituted, and before China was such a large scale, one of the largest bilateral lenders in the world. So there is a learning curve that China and Chinese institutions need to go through. So it's clear that China is going through that. It's engaging with the overall international architecture. They've been part of both the DSSI and the G20 processes for Zambia as well. And so it has been engaging. However, there is a process of learning. And we've also seen outside of those processes, because now Sri Lanka is a lower middle income country, unlike countries like Zambia. So there is a difference because some of the other international mechanisms can't be applied to Sri Lanka. Where China has most recently agreed to a restructuring is in Ecuador, where both CDB and Exim Bank are lenders. And what they've done is they've extended maturities as well as given interest and repayment moratoriums. So Ecuador's repayments to China again restart from 2027 onwards. So they've gotten a period of breathing space. So it's clear that China and China's institutions are ready to restructure, but they're going through a learning curve, as well as trying to come to an approach that is then able to apply, across the BRI countries. So it's essential that, I think it's wrong to isolate China as the only country that is finding it difficult to respond to this situation, because even the multilateral schemes such as DSSI and the G20 ones, they've been slow to act as well. For example, the Chad case, it took I think 12 to 24 months for that process to go through. So China is not the only country that's going through a learning process on how to respond to such a big debt crisis that the developing world is going through.
So restructuring debt with bilateral debt with China is possible, but you're also focusing more about the challenges the Chinese end will face, especially with Exim Bank and CDB. What are some of the challenges Sri Lanka will face? Like, will we face any challenges going into these bilateral negotiations? And how do you think our bureaucrats should proceed with these negotiations? Are there any advice that you would like to leave for them?
So overall on debt restructuring negotiations, we don't have expertise. So we would leave it up to the debt restructuring advisors the government has, hired. And what the government and what they seem to have advised the government is also to do the bilateral negotiations, but also to try to bring them onto a common, kind of an ad hoc bilateral table that functions essentially as a multilateral entity to do these negotiations that once the bilateral these conventions are done. So the challenge is not just the bilateral side of it, but also because of the the whole narrative about the debt trap and all of that, it also made it a bit tricky on a geopolitical scale in terms of these negotiations, because the Paris Club countries as well as India are also suspicious on what China's approach is. And therefore, there seems to be a tendency they're waiting on China to give out more details before they themselves proceed with the debt restructuring. And that kind of tussle, geopolitical tussle, is probably also a cause for what people are seeing as a delay in terms of both the bilateral debt restructuring, as well as that in turn causing a delay in terms of the IMF board approval process.
So does this mean that none of these restructuring processes will go through unless China comes forward with their proposals, or China takes the first step?
So what China's first steps are will be a critical part of the process. And the other side of it is what we've seen in both Suriname as well as Zambia, two other countries that started debt restructuring negotiations before us. Both of those countries have got IMF programs, but the progress in terms of the bilateral negotiations have not been great. In Suriname's case, it's been so bad that their IMF program essentially derailed, right? And in Suriname, China is also a major bilateral partner, but the amounts are small because it's a small country. But that's been a problem because there isn't really been progress because both the bilaterals as well as the private creditors are not really, ready to progress further. So that's been a problem. And even in Zambia, there is questions of whether China fully agrees with the IMF's assumptions about debt sustainability and restructuring. So yes, China is critical for the first moves, not just because China is a big lender in this case, but also because the other major lenders are closely watching China's approach. And they're holding back in terms of what they want to offer and waiting for China's approach to know a bit more details, because it's also valid because no one wants to go through the kind of situation that Suriname has gone through, where you approve an IMF program and then it derails afterwards because at the very beginning you didn't get the details down on it.
That sounds very, very well. There is hope, but there's also a lot of anticipation as to what would happen. So the both of you are scholars who are focusing on the political economic aspect. In what ways do you think this situation, especially with Sri Lanka, would interplay with some of the other BRI countries? Now there's hope for us because, like you mentioned, Suriname, Zambia, and even very recently restructured their loans with China. And I think there's a lot of, again, misinterpretation about Chinese bilateral negotiations. So how do you think this will affect the BRI countries and BRI projects?
Yeah, I think one way of this affecting BRI projects is now the biggest challenge that China faces in terms of debt restructuring is it's not the fact that they can't give any debt relief or anything to Sri Lanka. It's that they are very cautious about the precedents that they will make. Whatever they offer Sri Lanka, they'll have to offer it to the many other countries that are in debt distress. We see more and more countries defaulting on debt. Now we saw last week Ghana also defaulted on their debt, and that is not the only country, and many countries will inevitably go down the same path. So China, I mean, understandably are concerned because both Exim and CDB and even other Chinese banks have lent excessively to most of these countries. So that means their banking system will take a hit. How this will affect so therefore, so the first point being, this will affect the way in which that the future debt restructuring is going to happen. That's why I think it is also taking time, because not merely Sri Lanka matters, because they'll have to follow the precedent that they set in Sri Lanka and Zambia both, and then do follow up the same approach so that their banking system also doesn't take much of a hit. Secondly, how this affects the BRI countries in general in going forward is that this debt restructuring process will also sort of redefine the relationship between the Chinese banks and the state-owned enterprises, because the way in which BRI works is the banks provide funding and the state-owned enterprises do carry out the contracts. It's also export for the China, right? For example, China Harbor Corporation construct the Hambantota port, and similarly, different other Chinese state-owned enterprises construct highways, power plants, etc., etc. So they do these constructions, they do these projects based on the lending provided by the Exim or CDB. Now the Exim and CDB are the risk bearers. They are now realizing, okay, now we'll have to cut back on some debt, so we will not be able to lend to support the state-owned enterprises as much as we used to do, because there's a much more risk affiliated to that. So that realization, I think it's somewhat of happening. So that will redefine the relationship, that will inevitably slow down the BRI lending. And my belief is that Chinese banks would be a lot more cautious in going forward when they are doing the BRI lending.
So banks are going to be cautious. SOEs will not know what to do with the projects, ongoing projects, especially if they need refinancing. So how do you think this will affect future relations between Sri Lanka and China? If so, how would it affect it, and how would we have to redefine or reimagine the relationship, the bilateral relationship?
I mean, I'll add like a couple of points. Thilina can follow up on a much more in detail level. One is that the Sri Lanka needs China in going forward, not only for debt restructuring, but also for some sort of bridging finance and other supports also. And also we can't entirely rely on the European markets as well. So that will also be significantly problematic in the sense, because now we'll have to balance the India and China both. And then also that will redefine how we are going to deal with China in overall aspects, also whether we are going to have a free trade agreement. It's not only merely a debt matter, also like how do we deal with the investment, how do we deal with the trade. China used to be our largest importer for a few years. Now India is our largest importer. So all these things are at play, and how do you do with the geopolitics? I'm not quite sure at this point how the redefining of this relationship will happen. But Sri Lanka, in my opinion, will have to balance the both and going forward, because we are not in a position to entirely give up relations with China. It is an important partner in many of the economic and other aspects.
Basically, the importance of China, that Sri Lanka will continue to rely on China for further development and various bilateral relations, plus that regardless of all basically what you're saying is regardless of all the conversation, we will need both India and China, especially in this sense, since you're talking of China. China will continue to be an important partner in Sri Lanka's development process. So Umesh and Thilina, we've been conversing for a long time, and I know y'all are going through in Sri Lanka power cuts and various difficulties in connecting with me. Do you all have any last thoughts that you would like to leave our global audience about your research, about Sri Lanka's economic relations with China?
So maybe I can start with a few thoughts. So I think this is related to Umesh's last comments and about the future relationship as well, because a number of Chinese SOEs do have significant presence in Sri Lanka. The Hambantota port by China Merchant Port, and well as their terminal in the Colombo port, as well as Czech's large investment in Colombo Port City. So those SOEs overall also have a vested interest to continue to sustain the bilateral relationship, because their investments and how their return on those investments also rely on not just the bilateral relationship, but also Sri Lanka's economy, recovering and also prospering. So therefore, from that side, there will also be that push for the relationship to, grow, so that Sri Lanka's economy can recover and prosper, taking advantage of the Chinese market. As well as, of course, another reason why some of these Chinese, SOEs also invested in Sri Lanka is because they also want to partake in India's growth through Sri Lanka, right? So therefore, it's not just the India-China relationship is also not as antagonistic as it seems, internationally and in geopolitical terms. At the end of the day, when it comes to the economics, the business side of it, they do profit from each other's growth. And Sri Lanka can be a place where both entities from both sides do enjoy the growth in both Sri Lanka as well as the two major economies.
There are 2 points. One is that Sri Lanka is now talking about RCEP, joining the RCEP, and this will open a lot more markets to Sri Lanka. So these are quite important things, because Sri Lanka already has a trade agreement with India. The discussion with China hasn't been progressing for a few years now. But the fact that Sri Lanka wants to pursue RCEP, and also the previous plan was to upgrade Sri Lanka's existing free trade agreement with India into what we call an economic, technology and cooperation agreement. So that will facilitate what Thilina mentioned, about trading through Sri Lanka between China, and that will bring a lot of investments and facilitate growth not only for Sri Lanka but also for China, India as well. So that's just one aspect to look into, because that is certainly going to happen. That we can see that we are pushing towards that direction. We exactly don't know the political challenges that Sri Lanka might encounter in this process, but like theoretically, when you're looking at it, RCEP and ETCA both are very much on the cards, and both will be geopolitically important and economically important as well. And other thing is, when Sri Lanka is dealing with China, what Sri Lanka would require is much more institutional capacity, which Sri Lanka failed to develop through the middle income transition, which was one of the very problematic areas. One of the things that Sri Lanka led to this crisis was the failure to develop the institutions, failure to develop the frameworks, and failure to to absorb the risks or to be much more cautious. So I think that will have to come in, not only dealing with China also, but internationally. Now China is also realizing it. That's why after this this ongoing emerging market debt crisis, Chinese banks and SOEs also both would be much more cautious. So I think that the relationship going forward will take a different way compared to what we had now, with better institutional frameworks and the legal practices and the regulatory frameworks, etc.
So thank you, Umesh and Thilina. You all have spoken about the trilateral, the importance of Sri Lanka for both India and China. Plus, I think you all are leaving this conversation on a very important note, talking about the domestic factors, how be it China, be it Sri Lanka, we all do at some point need to focus on the internal mechanisms that are in place when engaging with each other. Very important and very brilliant point that you all are making at the end. So everyone, thank you so much for joining us for the CGA BRI talk series. And I would like to once again thank Umesh Moramudali and Thilina Panduwawala for joining us today and talking about their research on the evolving Chinese lending mechanisms in Sri Lanka. Thank you.